March 1991, on the south edge of Hastings in Adams County, Russell Coleman pulled a 1979 Chevrolet C20 pickup into the gravel mouth of Prairie Iron Equipment, and the truck announced him before he stepped out. The left fender was rusted through, the tailgate chain had been replaced with baling wire, and the odometer sat at 312,084 miles like a dare. Russell climbed down in patched overalls and a faded seed cap. Boots cracked at the crease and whitened by old fertilizer dust. Across the lot, salesmen in pressed jackets stood near bright paint and showroom glass, their trucks lined up with polished chrome and dealer tags. Men glanced over once and looked away with the quick judgment reserved for someone they believed was out of options. The social weather around him favored borrowing. That spring, operators within 20 miles were signing notes on $120,000 combines at 8.9%, then rolling annual renewals like they were rotating crops. A monthly payment of $2,493 had become normal talk at coffee counters. Russell walked past all of it, stopped beside a used tractor with faded green paint and sound compression, and asked one question about maintenance logs. The final number was $14,600. He wrote a cashier check. No finance office, no signature packet, no deferred interest pitch. He drove that tractor home behind the same rusted pickup to a farmhouse with peeling white paint, original furnace, and a kitchen table ledger where every line ended with the same word, paid. People read poverty into modesty because appearance is easy and arithmetic is hard. Russell did not correct them. He was 41 then, and by that age he had already watched debt turn competent men into anxious men, and anxious men into tired men who could not sleep through harvest rain. His father, Glenn Coleman, had farmed rented ground through the 1970s and early 1980s, and Glenn was not reckless. He was careful, church regular, and up before daylight, but in 1981 he carried operating debt at 17.2%, machinery debt at 13.9%, and a land contract payment that did not care what corn brought in October. One season of weak yields and one rate reset took the margin away. Russell stood in a sale barn lane that winter and watched neighbors buy his father's tools one lot at a time. Glenn did not shout. He took off his cap, thanked people for fair bids, and went home quieter than Russell had ever seen him. Glenn found wage work after that and rebuilt a decent life, but the lesson stayed branded in Russell's mind with far more force than any speech could have carried. Debt was not evil in theory. Debt was brittle in practice. It worked until weather, price, or rate moved the wrong direction. Russell started farming for himself in 1983 on 120 rented acres and 40 owned acres he purchased from a retiring cousin for $32,000, with $18,000 down and the balance paid in 20 months by custom baling, night welding, and grain hauling. He lived like a man on probation. In 1984, he grossed $68,400 and spent $51,270, leaving $17,130 to split between taxes and principal. In 1985, he grossed $74,900 and spent $53,110, leaving $21,790. In 1986, hail cut yield hard, gross fell to $56,200, and because his fixed obligations were low, he still closed positive by $4,980. He built his method one line at a time. 1987, bought 80 acres at $790 per acre, total $63,200, paid over 17 months, no bank lien. 1988, replaced worn planter units with used parts, $1,140, versus $8,900 for a dealer package. 1989. Grain storage shortage solved with a used bin and labor from two neighbors. $6,700 total, instead of $29,400 installed new. 1990. Carried zero operating debt into spring, prepaid fertilizer with winter basis gains, saved $2,360. 1991. Bought that $14,600 tractor cash, while peers financed newer iron with 7-year amortization. He did not chase acreage first. He chased staying power. He protected downside first and accepted slower upside. By the time he entered Prairie Iron that March morning, he had already structured his life around one stubborn principle. If a bank could call it, then weather could take it. His household budget looked like a ledger from another era. Property taxes and insurance on the farmhouse, $4,980. Utilities with wood heat supplement, $2,460. Food, mostly home-cooked and bulk purchased, $5,900. Clothing and work boots, $620. Pickup repairs and fuel, $3,840. Medical and miscellaneous, $4,100. Church family gifts and local giving, $1,500. Total, $23,400. When a year ran better than expected, the excess went to land reserve, grain reserve, or treasury notes. He did not call it wealth. He called it breathing room. The part most people missed was labor discipline. Russell treated maintenance as an investment category, not a nuisance. He rebuilt hydraulic lines at his own bench, changed fluids on schedule by engine hours, and kept a parts shelf labeled by machine model and year. In 1992, he spent $3,780 on parts and consumables that prevented a transmission failure estimated at $11,500. In 1993, he bought a salvage header trailer for $900, repaired it with $240 in steel and bearings, and avoided hiring transport every season. His combine was old enough to be ignored by sales flyers, but field-ready every fall. The machinery looked worn. The balance sheet looked stronger every year. Auctions became his classroom and his edge. He arrived early, carried a notebook, and set hard ceilings before bidding started. If a disc was worth $3,200 to him, he stopped at $3,200, even when another bidder nudged to $3,300. If an auger needed $700 in work and would serve 6 years, he paid $1,450 and no more. In 1994, he passed on a loader tractor that sold for $18,500 because projected repair plus purchase would have pushed total cost above $24,000. 3 months later, he bought a different unit for $12,200 and put $2,900 into it. Full cost, $15,100. He did not win every lot. He won enough. More important, he never lost control of his cash position to emotion. By the second week of October 1995, local coffee talk had hardened into a verdict about him. Too cautious, too slow, too proud to leverage. Men who liked him still said it with a shrug, because in that decade, expansion looked rational, and lenders were eager. Russell listened, nodded, and kept writing in the ledger. That winter, he reviewed a proposed financed equipment package from a dealer who promised efficiency gains and tax advantages. Total sticker, $352,000, down payment, $35,200, interest 8.6%, term 7 years, projected total cost, $486,700 after finance charges and fees. He folded the quote into the back of his notebook and then built a staged cash plan across 5 years instead. targeting good used equipment and rebuildable units for an estimated $271,400 all in. He did not present it as a speech. He treated it as math. There was no glamour in his strategy, and that was exactly the point. He drove the same pickup. He lived in the same peeling farmhouse. He replaced a kitchen faucet himself for $38 rather than paying a $260 service call. He delayed a roof replacement one season to buy seed and prepaid crop insurance, then replaced the roof in cash the next year for $4,900. He sold grain when basis and storage costs favored movement. Not when neighbors said the market felt hot. Every decision looked small in isolation. Together they built an operation that could absorb shock. By late summer 1996, Russell had cash reserves, paid for machinery, and a reputation for being old-fashioned in a county that preferred momentum. Then Leonard Pike died suddenly, and 320 adjoining acres went to probate with a 30-day close. Then the phones started ringing across Adams County before daylight had fully reached the fields, and by noon the courthouse hallway carried the same low sentence from every mouth. Pike ground, 30-day close, no extensions. Leonard Pike had kept his records orderly, so there was no dispute over acreage, no family fight, no delay. 320 acres, contiguous enough to change any operator's future, would be sold at probate auction with earnest money due immediately and full settlement by wire within a month. Men who had never missed a payment still went pale doing the arithmetic in their heads. At prevailing terms, a buyer using borrowed money would need a financing package near $500,000 just to be competitive, then additional operating liquidity to plant around the new acres. The land itself was level and productive, averaging 176 bushels of corn in ordinary years, and the county knew exactly what that meant. It meant pressure. Russell drove into Hastings the next morning in the same 1979 Chevrolet C20, rust dark against late autumn light, engine ticking unevenly at idle. He parked between a 2-year-old diesel with chrome wheel arches and a polished sport utility with a bank decal on the rear glass. When he stepped into the loan office, his cap brim had grease at the edge and one overall knee was patched twice in different denim shades. Behind the desk sat Bryce Harlan in a pressed blue shirt, cufflinks, and a watch that caught the fluorescent lights each time he moved a file. Bryce had built a reputation on speed and confidence. He financed growth, and he did not apologize for it. He slid a folder across the desk and spoke in the brisk tone of a man used to setting the tempo. If you want Pike ground, this is the lane. $500,000 operating and acquisition package. Variable at 9.4%. Annual interest near $47,000 before principal reduction. We can structure cash flow off projected yields. Russell opened the folder, read every page, and asked 2 questions about reset language and collateral cross default. Bryce answered both, then leaned back with the expression of someone certain the conversation was already finished. Nobody scales without notes, Russell. You know that. Russell closed the folder. I know what callable means. That is not how modern farms run. It is how mine runs. The folder stayed on the desk when Russell stood up. He thanked Bryce, walked out, and drove north past fields already stripped for winter. People later said the refusal happened in 3 sentences. What mattered was not the brevity. What mattered was that he had prepared for this moment years before Leonard Pike died. By the first week of December 1996, Russell had moved cash in 3 steps that looked unremarkable unless someone read the ledgers side by side. He liquidated $122,000 in treasury notes purchased during high-margin years. He transferred $96,000 from grain reserve after pricing remaining bushels through staggered contracts. He combined that with $166,000 in retained earnings held specifically for adjacent land opportunities. Total liquid bidding capacity, $384,000. He had also kept $71,500 separate for spring input protection, so the purchase would not cannibalize planting discipline. That partition, more than any single bold move, explained why his strategy held together under stress. At coffee counters, men still interpreted his frayed sleeves as scarcity. The prevailing assumption was that a farmer who replaced a truck tailgate chain with baling wire could not possibly be ready for a probate contest. Yet Russell had spent 13 years treating optional spending as the enemy of mandatory resilience. He tracked replacement cycles by hours, not fashion. He bought parts in off-season lots when prices softened. He repaired before failure where possible. And when failure came anyway, he had cash. That was the backbone. His year-by-year record from the early 90s through Pike's auction read like a plain notebook, but the arithmetic carried force. 1992. Gross farm income, $81,340. Total operating and household outflow, $61,880. Surplus $19,460, of which $14,000 went to reserve, and $5,460 to tax and contingency. 1993, gross $88,710, outflow $64,920, surplus $23,790, reserve up to $37,500 after year-end obligations. 1994, gross $93,280, outflow $67,410, surplus $25,870, plus $2,200 from custom hauling directed to equipment sinking fund. 1995, gross $97,560, outflow $70,060, surplus $27,500, including prepaid insurance and fertilizer discount capture. 1996 through harvest, before the probate notice. Gross booked $101,240, outflow to date $71,890, with $29,350 retained and uncommitted. No operating carry note, no machinery lien, no shortfall panic. 3 days before the auction, Bryce repeated his position at the courthouse steps to a cluster of operators waiting on title packets. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Cash buyers for this size tract are rare. Most people here understand leverage is how you compete. He glanced toward Russell's truck and looked back to the group. The implication landed without being spoken. Appearance still argued one story. Numbers were about to argue another. Auction day came cold and bright. The room filled early. Metal chairs lined in rows, caps in laps, legal pads open. The opening bid moved quickly, then slowed near levels where financed buyers had to recalculate debt service against uncertain commodity prices. Russell lifted his card in measured increments and never looked around the room. At $384,000 for 240 acres of the tract, the contest narrowed and then stopped. The clerk called final, stamped receipt, and read the buyer line aloud. Title to transfer free of institutional lien, pending close. Bryce was standing near the side wall when those words reached him. No one cheered. This was not that kind of county, but silence held for an extra beat, and in that pause the social hierarchy shifted a notch. Before we go any further, if you want to see how one decision at this auction rippled across 2 decades of drought, rate shocks, and foreclosures, stay with the story to the end, because the later math is where his philosophy becomes undeniable. Russell drove home without detouring through town. He parked beside the machine shed, carried the auction envelope inside, and wrote 2 lines in the kitchen ledger. Pike tracked 240 acres, $384,000 committed cash, remaining reserve after partition intact. He underlined the second line once. Then he went out to service a feeder chain on the combine because wheat stubble did not care about public moments. Winter settled in, and with it came the routine that had always made his outcomes look calm from the outside. Mondays were parts and maintenance planning. Tuesdays and Wednesdays were welding, hydraulic work, and tool inventory. Thursdays he reviewed basis movement and storage costs. Fridays were books, bills, and tax positioning. Saturdays, when weather allowed, he visited 2 or 3 auctions, not to buy everything, but to observe pricing drift and condition patterns. He believed discipline was easier when converted into schedule. Mood could change. Schedule held. In January 1997, he bought 80 additional acres at $1,250 per acre from an aging owner who wanted certainty over delay, total $100,000 paid by cashier, check after closing costs. That purchase would have been a textbook financing candidate under prevailing advice. A 7-year note at 8.1% on $100,000 would have required roughly $18,700 per year in blended payment, with total repayment near $130,900. Russell paid once and removed interest from the equation entirely. When corn dipped or diesel rose, there was still no lender letter waiting in the mailbox. By mid-February, he inspected his 1979 Chevrolet himself, replaced brake lines for $186 in parts, and postponed bodywork again. The cab still rattled at idle, and rust still ate the lower fender seam, but the truck started every morning. He cared about function before image in every category of spending. The same month, he declined a dealer promotion on a nearly new planter package, priced at $48,700 with seasonal financing options, and instead bought a used row unit lot for $7,900 plus $1,420 in rebuild components. Total $9,320. Similar field performance at his scale. Difference preserved. $39,380 before interest. By early spring, neighbors who had expanded on credit were not villains in Russell's eyes. They were good farmers navigating a system that rewarded optimism right up to the moment it punished volatility. He helped where he could in practical ways, lending labor during breakdowns, sharing a spare coupler, trading hauling days. He kept his comments short when asked about debt. Know your worst year first. Do the downside math. If you must borrow, keep exits open. He never preached at coffee. He never gloated after an auction. He understood too well what foreclosure felt like from the spectator line. One evening in March, he spread his worksheets across the kitchen table and compared 2 machinery paths side by side. Path A financed modernization package over 7 years, principal and fees leading to total cash outflow projected at $486,700. Path B staged cash acquisitions and rebuilds over comparable capacity horizon, $271,400. Difference, $215,300 retained. If that difference were redirected into land at conservative values, future earning capacity compounded. If it vanished into finance charges, Resilience narrowed. The numbers did not guarantee success. They widened survivable scenarios. That was his whole argument, and it required no dramatic language. By the second week of May 1997, planning finished under clean moisture and moderate wind, Russell had positioned his operation with 4 buffers instead of 1, paid land obligations, unpledged machinery, separated input reserve, and controlled household burn rates still under $28,000 annualized. He was not the biggest operator in the township, not close. Yet he was becoming the hardest to break. The judgment about him did not disappear after Pike. It evolved. Some still called him stubborn. Others started calling him disciplined, usually after balancing their own renewal packets against nights of interrupted sleep. Bryce continued writing large notes for ambitious expansions and remained influential at the bank. Russell continued showing up in patched denim and a rusted truck, lifting his bid card only when he could settle with certainty. 2 men in the same county, 2 coherent philosophies, 1 long test coming with every season that followed. And the test did come, in forms no spreadsheet could fully predict, but by then Russell had already chosen the one variable he could control. No one could call his land. By the next Monday, Russell had moved from principle to cadence. He rose at 4:40, checked moisture reports, and then sat at the kitchen table with a sharpened pencil and the same ruled ledger format he had used since 1983. The entry for that week had no drama in it, only structure. Spring input reserve, $71,500 untouched. Pike tract deed recorded. Machinery sinking fund, $18,200. Household envelope on pace for $24,100 annual spend. He treated every dollar as assigned labor. Unassigned cash drifted. Assigned cash endured. With Leonard Pike's 240 acres already closed and recorded, Russell kept stacking small, unshowy gains through the rest of 1997. In the margin beside the purchase line, he had written the title recording number, and then a second line that mattered more to him than acreage count. 0 lien holder. Corn averaged 171 bushels per acre across his better ground. Soybeans 49, and gross receipts landed at $118,460 with total farm outflow at $83,740. Net before taxes and depreciation, $34,720. He directed $12,000 to Treasury notes, $9,500 to a land opportunity reserve, $6,800 to machinery reserve, and left the balance for tax and contingency. In 1998, when diesel lifted and fertilizer climbed, he still closed positive. Gross $124,980, outflow $91,060, margin $33,920. He did not add lifestyle spending. He added buffers. By late harvest 1999, he was farming more acres than people realized because he took short cash rent parcels. Others skipped for being too small or awkwardly shaped. He accepted lower headline efficiency to avoid large financing commitments. That year, he paid $18,400 total rent on 3 tracts, harvested 166 bushels corn average and 47 soybean average, and booked $129,300 gross against $95,700 outflow, margin $33,600 again, with commodity prices offering little generosity. When neighbors asked how he kept landing on similar margins in uneven markets, the answer was that his fixed obligations stayed thin, and his repair labor stayed high. In 2000, he logged 312 hours of in-house maintenance work valued at $0 on paper, and roughly $19,000 in avoided outside labor in practical terms. Then came the equipment and storage decisions that would define his next decade. In 2001, he bought grain bins for $42,300 cash after negotiating off-season installation and handling site prep himself. A finance package at 7.8% over 10 years would have pushed total cost near $61,900. Cash saved him about $19,600 and removed another recurring payment from future dry years. In 2002, he bought a used semi-tractor for $11,800 and put $3,200 into brakes, tires, and lights. Comparable newer unit on payments would have run roughly $1,180 monthly. He took the slower lane and kept optionality. In 2003, he sold old crop in 3 tranches, averaged $2.64 per bushel corn and $7.01 soybeans, and still added $21,400 to reserves because he refused to let household spending rise above $26,500. The 2004 combine decision turned into one of his clearest examples for younger farmers years later. A bankruptcy sale listed a used combine with honest wear and complete maintenance logs. Russell bought it for $61,000, then spent $7,900 over the next 14 months replacing high-wear components. Total all-in, $68,900. The nearest dealer alternative carried a $214,000 sticker before financing and setup fees. At 7.1% over 7 years, finance total would have approached $264,300. Difference in lifetime cash outflow, $195,400. He redirected that difference into land reserve and government notes. In his ledger, that line had one comment: capacity secured, cash preserved. From 2005 through 2008, the progression looked almost boring from outside, which was exactly why it worked. 2005, gross $147,220, outflow $108,930, net $38,290, reserve contributions $25,000. 2006, gross $152,480, outflow $111,100, net $41,380, household expenses $27,200. 2007, prepaid seed and fertilizer in winter dips saved $4,870, closed year with $46,100, free cash after tax set aside. 2008, market volatility widened basis risk, so he leaned on his bins and sold in disciplined windows, preserving $18,600 of value that would have been lost in panic movement at harvest lows. He still drove the rusted 1979 pickup, now at 361,000 miles, and still patched his own coat sleeves. By the first week of March 2009, another opportunity opened when 160 acres adjoining one of his rented parcels came available at $2,100 per acre. Total purchase price, $336,000. He paid cash from the exact reserves he had built by not financing machinery glitz in earlier years. A conventional note at 6.4% over 20 years on that amount would have required annual payments around $29,900 and total repayment near $598,000. Interest avoided, roughly $262,000. His total owned acreage rose, but his stress profile did not. He kept his operating model intact and his household budget under $28,000, even after replacing a failing well pump and finally repainting two sides of the farmhouse. Years later, when younger farmers sat across from him at the same kitchen table, he often framed the question this way: if a best year depends on borrowed momentum, what funds the worst year when prices fall and weather cuts yield? He would tell them to stay with the numbers because the next stretch was where strategy and circumstance separated neighbors who all worked hard. Eli Matson had every reason to believe his expansion was sound. He was competent, careful with agronomy, and respected across the county. Between 2007 and 2011, he expanded to roughly 1,180 acres through a mix of ownership and high cash rent, financing land and equipment, with floating rate structures that started manageable and then moved against him. By 2012, his total debt load reached about $1.18 million. When rates reset and margins narrowed, annual debt service climbed faster than his gross could compensate. One note alone moved from 5.2% to 8.1%, adding about $21,000 yearly interest burden. Eli sold machinery first, then parcels, then faced the loss of approximately 600 acres in staged disposals and distressed sales. He did not fail from laziness. He got trapped by timing and leverage. Nora Bell's trajectory carried the same pattern in a different form. She refinanced machinery twice to keep upgrading during years when custom work looked strong. Her monthly payment package eventually reached $9,240 across equipment and operating lines. At corn above $5, it looked tight but serviceable. When corn slid below $4 and input costs stayed elevated, her margin compressed in both directions. A single, delayed receivable cycle put her behind. Then penalties and fees compounded the gap. She was one of the hardest workers in the county, often in the yard before sunrise, but hard work could not neutralize amortization math on shrinking revenue. She liquidated 2 newer units at unfavorable prices and lost negotiating power with lenders almost overnight. Pete and Aaron Lutz followed advice that had worked for many during easier cycles: scale fast, lock in acres, and finance efficiency. They expanded with a leverage package that looked rational on optimistic yield projections, then got hit by 2 consecutive weaker production years and softer commodity pricing. Their plan assumed enough cushion to ride 1 poor season. It did not survive 2. By 2015, after restructuring attempts and asset sales, foreclosure proceedings moved forward and the brothers watched equipment and ground go through auction. The county did not mock them. People showed up, bought fairly, and looked away when the final lots closed. Good men, wrong structure for bad years. 3 days after the Lutz auction, Russell wrote them both a note and enclosed contact numbers for 2 mechanic shops and 1 welding contractor looking for reliable people. He did not make a speech about debt. He made introductions and then went back to planning. That detail mattered because his philosophy was never about being right in public. It was about staying useful when others were in trouble. The broader crisis pressure came in overlapping layers rather than one dramatic shock. Input costs jumped in 2011 and 2012. Parts lead time stretched. Then drought conditions in 2012 into 2013 cut yields across the region, and crop insurance helped but did not restore full revenue. Russell's own production took a hit, with corn yields on some tracts dropping more than 20% from his 5-year average. Yet when his gross fell, no lender could accelerate his land notes because there were none. No machinery financier could demand cure payments because there were none. He paid land taxes, paid inputs, paid labor, and carried zero operating debt into the next spring. In 2013 alone, despite drought pressure, he cleared every bill and ended the season with modest but positive retained earnings. By late October 2014, when market sentiment turned hard and lenders tightened standards for renewals, the contrast between business models became stark in plain arithmetic. A highly leveraged 1,200-acre operation in the area might face fixed annual debt service north of $180,000 before seed, fertilizer, fuel, labor, and rent. Russell's fixed financial service was effectively zero because he had removed interest obligations from his structure over decades. He still had risk. Weather, disease, and price did not spare him. But risk without fixed debt behaves differently than risk with fixed debt. One model bends, the other breaks faster. In 2015 and 2016, as foreclosure notices and forced sales appeared in legal columns, with unsettling regularity, Russell doubled down on liquidity discipline instead of expansion excitement. He capped discretionary spending, postponed a shed addition, and held larger cash positions than his own comfort preferred. He purchased short treasury instruments yielding modest returns and kept them laddered for access. He tracked household outflow at $27,640 in 2015 and $27,910 in 2016. He replaced the pickup transmission for $2,140 rather than buying newer. At coffee counters, he remained the same man in patched denim, still underestimated by newcomers, still writing checks without liens when he chose to buy. By early winter 2017, younger operators had started asking to see his books, quietly at first, then openly on Saturdays. They were not asking how to look wealthy. They were asking how to survive bad sequences without surrendering land. Russell set an extra chair at the kitchen table, opened the ledger, and pointed to one recurring pattern. Every avoided interest dollar became future freedom. Across 20 years, his deliberate cash purchases, deferred upgrades, reserve ladders, and low household burn had built an operation that could absorb shocks that had broken larger, shinier ones. The county still had people who called him stubborn. More and more began calling him unbreakable. The first young farmer to arrive that Saturday stayed after the others left, turning his cap in his hands while Russell totaled columns in silence. He finally asked the question people usually avoided in public. How much are you actually sitting on? Russell did not answer with a boast or a rounded number. He turned the ledger around and pointed to 3 lines. Paid land at conservative county value, $6,940,000. Cash and treasury ladder, $1,870,000. Grain and input position, net of obligations, $412,000. Then he tapped the final line, written in block print. Estimated net worth, $9,222,000. Liens, $0. The young man stared at Russell's patched sleeve, then back at the page, as if the two facts could not occupy the same room. Russell only said, "What matters is structure." By the second week of March 2018, Hastings First Community had assembled a legacy agriculture panel with 3 retired bank presidents, seated under bright lights at the Civic Hall, and Russell sat at the end in his faded cap, jacket cuffs frayed, boots cleaned but scarred by 30 years of work. The moderator expected stories about weather and technology. Instead, each banker gave the same admission in different words. Thomas Reeves said he had renewed notes all around Russell for 2 decades and had never once seen his signature. Calvin Morrow said he had tried 3 times to pitch low-rate leverage and had never opened a file on him. Dean Kessler laughed softly and said, "He was the only large operator in my portfolio area who never became my customer." The room reacted with a murmur that carried a strange mix of respect and embarrassment. Men who had read poverty into peeling paint were hearing a balance sheet they had not imagined. After the panel, Bryce Harlan waited near the coffee urn with the composed face of someone who still trusted his framework. He told Russell rates were favorable again, that disciplined leverage was still rational, that scale would matter even more in the next decade. Russell listened and nodded once. "Maybe. I still buy Sleep First?" Bryce held his gaze for a second longer than courtesy required, then looked past him to the crowd gathering around the retired bankers. By early April, Saturday sessions at Russell's kitchen table were full enough that he added 2 folding chairs and started photocopying one worksheet: financed path versus staged cash path, line by line, fee by fee, interest by interest. At one of those crowded table sessions, Russell posed the question, plainly to the room: when money was cheap and everyone around them was accelerating, did they optimize for speed or survivability? He believed that answer determined who was still standing when a sequence of bad years arrived, and he had 20 pages of arithmetic to prove why. By late March 2021, the Hargrave estate notice hit Adams County like a weather alert. 640 acres of prime ground, contiguous, tiled, high productivity, closing window tight enough that funded buyers had a real advantage. Bryce had already organized an investor group with prearranged debt at 5.6%, projected annual service just above $310,000 before taxes and operating volatility. On paper, it looked formidable. Russell prepared differently. He liquidated $2,410,000 from Treasury notes across 4 maturities, moved $3,180,000 from retained earnings accounts, and transferred $1,630,000 from crop reserve and money market positions. Total verified funds, $7,220,000. Estimated bid target plus fees, $7,180,000. Remaining liquidity after close, about $40,000 immediately, plus unsold grain inventory and unpledged equipment. Auction day opened cold with a bright wind, and the parking area told its own story. New trucks, corporate sport utilities, dealer jackets, lender folders clipped and color-coded. Russell arrived in the same 1979 Chevrolet, now past 400,000 miles, with rust deep along the rocker panel and a driver door that needed a shoulder nudge to close. Inside, the bid pace moved fast through the early increments and slowed near levels where debt service models became tight. Russell bid in 3 clean steps and stopped speaking when the room hesitated. Final call landed at $7.04 million. The title attorney requested proof of funds on microphone protocol, and Russell handed over verification letters and transfer receipts. The attorney read the closing language plainly. Buyer funds verified. No institutional note attached to purchase. The room stayed quiet for one full breath, then chairs shifted, and whispers started in every row. Bryce did not shout, did not leave, did not pretend the moment meant nothing. He stepped to the side microphone when invited and said the sentence that followed him for the rest of his career. I spent 25 years telling him debt was necessary, and not one of us ever held his note. It was not humiliation so much as recalibration in public. The arithmetic had settled a long argument. Within 3 weeks of closing, Russell declined 2 offers to lease the entire Hargrave tract to outside operators and instead structured the decision that made his wealth legible as philosophy rather than private victory. The trust endowment did not come from that thin post-auction cash line. It was funded from non-auction assets, including separate retained reserves and post-close asset reallocation completed after settlement. He established the Coleman Ground Lease Trust with a $3.2 million endowment, drafted by local council and administered with a 5-member board. Russell, a retired extension agronomist, an accountant, a cooperative manager, and 1 rotating seat for a working farmer under 40. Trust rules were strict and clear. 0 interest operating loans capped at $75,000. Quarterly reporting required. No cash-out refinancing of depreciating machinery. Any recipient who reached stable profitability would mentor 2 new operators for 2 seasons. He wrote the first 6 checks before harvest ended, each for $75,000. Total deployed $450,000. The recipients were chosen for discipline rather than polish. Dana Madsen, Eli's daughter, leased 300 acres and needed working capital for seed, fertilizer, and fuel without taking high-rate operating paper. Grant amount through the trust loan, $75,000 at 0%, 36-month term, first payment deferred until post-harvest year 1. Miguel Santos, first-generation operator on 180 rented acres, received $75,000 and used $28,400 for prepaid inputs, $19,700 for irrigation repairs, $12,900 for insurance and taxes, the balance as liquidity cushion. Erin Coe, who had strong yield records but no collateral history, used her $75,000 to secure early pay discounts that saved $6,180 in 1 season. Travis Weller replaced predatory short-term credit with a trust loan and cut annual interest expense by $9,400. Jana Feld stabilized a mixed grain and hay operation with $75,000 and avoided liquidating core equipment. Malik Rowan used his $75,000 to lock rent and input commitments before spring volatility. Russell made one more decision that county appraisers still cite as the clearest signal of intent. He sold 120 acres to Dana Madsen at $4,200 per acre when comparable local sales were near $6,100. Total sale price, $504,000. Market value at prevailing comps, $732,000. Embedded transfer of opportunity, $228,000. He did not call it charity. He called it a fair start without a noose. The deed included a right of first refusal clause to prevent immediate flipping, and Dana accepted it without argument because she understood the point was stewardship, not arbitrage. Nora Bell's turn came through a different channel. Her custom planting business had demand but lacked machinery access on workable terms, so Russell directed a $48,000 grant from the trust earnings to cover her machinery, cooperative share, and tied it to one condition. She would mentor 2 new operators through budgeting, scheduling, and maintenance planning for at least 2 years. She agreed, then exceeded the condition by taking 3 mentees in the first cycle. By the end of her second full season under the new structure, Nora's crew posted positive net income of $86,300, maintained an on-time supplier record, and carried no revolving high-interest equipment debt. By August 2022, Eli Madsen, who had once lost 600 acres under floating rate pressure, was managing 300 leased acres with payment discipline that would have looked unremarkable to outsiders and extraordinary to anyone who knew his history. He was current on every obligation. Pete Lutz, after years of strain, had steady work as a mechanic at Hastings Ag Service, with annual wages of $63,000, plus overtime during harvest. Aaron Lutz farmed 90 acres debt-free on weekends and held a weekday grain facility position that covered household needs without borrowing against land. None of these outcomes erased pain from earlier years. They did prove that good people could recover when the financing structure stopped extracting from every bad month. At the end of one mentoring review, Russell closed the folder and told the group to pass the arithmetic to one person who still thought cash discipline was old-fashioned. Most failures in this story were not failures of effort. They were failures of structure under stress. Russell kept deeper records than anyone expected, and in winter 2023, he opened them for a full review with the trust board and 3 younger farmers at his kitchen table. The sequence from 2018 through 2024 made the case without rhetoric. 2018, net worth $9.8 million, 0 liens, cash equivalents $2.1 million. 2019, net worth $10.6 million, added retained earnings $640,000 after tax and capital upkeep. 2020, net worth $11.4 million, elevated cash buffer during uncertainty, no forced asset sales. 2021, after Hargrave purchase and revaluation, net worth $15.9 million, debt service obligation $0. 2022, after trust capitalization and gifts, net worth $16.8 million, trust assets $3.2 million, ring-fenced from operating accounts. 2023, net worth $17.7 million, with conservative landmarks, loan repayment rate in trust, cohort 100% on schedule. Early 2024, net worth $18.6 million, still no liens, still the same truck, same house, same capped household spend, now $27,980. Then they ran the multiplier calculation. 6 zero-interest loans totaling $450,000 replaced borrowing that would have averaged 8.2% in local commercial channels, avoiding about $110,700 in cumulative interest over 3 years. Dana's below-market land transfer preserved $228,000 of equity at day one. Nora's $48,000 grant supported a business that generated payroll and subcontracted work in-county. Combined acreage touched directly by trust loans, and the discounted transfer reached 1,190 acres by 2024. At an average county value of $6,300 per acre, that operating footprint represented $7,497,000 in productive ground influenced by one discipline cycle turning outward. Bryce retired in 2024, and his resolution was not bitterness. At a lender workshop in Grand Island, he told younger officers that volume metrics hide fragility, and that cash resilience should be underwritten as seriously as collateral. He used Russell's name with permission and repeated the line everyone remembered. Not one note. Not in 25 years. Russell stayed in Adams County, still driving the rusted Chevrolet, still arriving early to auctions with a hard ceiling written in pencil, still ending ledger lines the same way. Paid. Paid stayed, underlined in graphite, while the others at the table gathered their coats. Dana Madsen lingered long enough to hand Russell her updated worksheet, and he read it the way he read any line item, without ceremony. Year 1 on the 120 acres she bought from him at $4,200 per acre, she grossed $186,400 across corn and soybeans, held total operating outflow to $141,900, and sent her first trust payment exactly on schedule. Year 2. Better weather and tighter input timing pushed gross to $204,700 with outflow at $149,300, and she prepaid the next quarter. By harvest 2024, she had reduced principal on her zero-interest $75,000 loan to $18,000 outstanding, built a machinery reserve of $43,600, and kept a separate tax account of $21,400. She also completed her mentorship requirement and then continued anyway, meeting twice a month with two beginning operators from Clay County who brought binders full of scattered receipts and left with real ledgers. Miguel Santos took a different route but landed at the same principle. He did not chase acreage first, he stabilized costs first. His first season under the trust loan, he locked fertilizer early and bought used irrigation components in January auctions, saving $8,900 against in-season pricing. In the second season, he shifted 42 acres to a lower input rotation on weaker ground and improved net margin per acre by $73. By September 2024, he had repaid $52,000 of principal and sat on a $31,200 liquidity buffer that kept him out of short-term credit lines during a late fuel spike. He began helping at Russell's winter sessions, usually quiet, occasionally adding one sentence that carried weight because it came from the lived experience. Cash is not fear. Cash is time. Erin Coe, who had once been treated as high risk because she lacked collateral history, used her $75,000 exactly as planned and then did something the trust board tracked closely. She documented every early pay discount, every avoided fee, and every repair deferral that did not compromise yield. Her first two seasons produced cumulative savings of $14,460 compared with her prior financing pattern. She cleared the full trust balance in 30 months, 6 months ahead of schedule, and used the released cash flow to buy a used grain cart for $19,800 in cash rather than signing a 5-year note that would have carried total repayment above $28,000. Travis Weller eliminated revolving equipment credit, cut annual interest expense by $9,400 as projected, and then redirected that exact amount into a sinking fund. Jonafeld stabilized hay and grain operations, then hired one full-time employee at $46,800 salary plus seasonal overtime, the first steady payroll position on her place in years. Malik Rowan used his window of stability to negotiate 3-year rent terms with capped annual increases, reducing uncertainty more than reducing headline rent, and that contract discipline kept his planning horizon intact. At the end of that meeting, Russell set Dana's sheet on top of the trust binder and looked around the kitchen table at the remaining cups and pencils. "If you had to choose," he said, not raising his voice, "between faster growth and staying uncallable in your worst year, which one stands up when no one is watching?" Nobody answered right away. They did not need to. The question sat under every spreadsheet in his kitchen, even when nobody said it aloud. January 28th, 2025, the trust board met in the back room at Hastings Cooperative Annex with winter coats still damp from sleet by the door. The first 6 loans, totaling $450,000, were no longer treated as hopeful experiments. 4 were fully repaid. 2 were current and on track. Principal recovered and reissued reached $332,000. The board approved 4 new zero-interest loans at $60,000 each for a second cohort that included 2 livestock grain mixed operators and 1 husband-wife team, transitioning from custom work into leased acres. Total active and completed support since inception, stood at $690,000 deployed with no delinquency. A side memo ran the comparison Russell always requested. If that same capital flow had moved through conventional operating channels at an average 8.2%, estimated cumulative interest burden across cohorts would have exceeded $167,000 by that point. Instead, the money remained local as working capacity. March 19th, 2025, after a windy day of pre-plant checks, Russell wrote a new page in the ruled book and copied figures from the trust dashboard into the margin beside seed delivery dates. Acreage directly strengthened by trust loans, discounted transfer equity, and mentorship-linked operational changes reached 1,940 acres. Indirectly affected acreage through cooperative machinery access and shared labor schedules added another 1,120 acres. Combined productive footprint, 3,060 acres. At a conservative county value of $6,450 per acre, the operating ground under lower fragility totaled $19,737,000. The arithmetic showed up beyond paper. Suppliers were getting paid on time. Landlords were seeing fewer emergency renegotiations. Local repair shops had steadier winter work instead of panic calls in April. June 11th, 2025, Bryce Harlan drove out to Russell's place in a 3-year-old pickup that was clean but no longer showroom bright. A storm line stacked west of the machine shed while they stood on packed gravel and talked without audience or panel table between them. Bryce had left his formal lending role in 2024, but he had kept showing up in regional credit trainings with anonymized case files and hard outcomes. He told Russell he had revised the guidance he gave new lenders. Less emphasis on loan volume, more on stress-tested survival. He admitted that he used to treat liquidity as idle potential and now treated it as operating armor. Russell listened, then pointed to the old combine and said, "Armor is boring until weather turns." They shook hands. No grand reconciliation speech. Just two men older than their argument finally aligned on what bad years do to thin structures. August 2025, at a regional lender workshop in Grand Island, Bryce put 2 columns on the screen for a room of younger officers. High-volume portfolio growth with thin liquidity versus moderate growth with documented cash resilience. He walked through default behavior under 2 bad crop years and a rate jump. The room got quiet for the same reason auction rooms got quiet when proof of funds hit the microphone. Numbers stripped pride out of the debate. By harvest, he had become an unlikely ally for conservative underwriting. He referred 3 young operators to the trust after telling them plainly that his old advice would have pushed them too fast. He also persuaded one bank board to add a resilience ratio to internal review, measuring months of operating expense held in liquid reserve. His summary line, repeated often, stayed unchanged. "I was wrong about necessity. Debt can help, but cash keeps you alive when plans fail." It was not disgrace. It was correction. And it mattered because people listened when it came from someone who had once argued the opposite. October 2025, during a Saturday session in Russell's shop, a new renter from Webster County said, Bigger always felt safer if the market was running. Dana slid him 2 sheets, one with projected expansion returns, one with downside coverage under a yield hit and rate increase. Miguel tapped the second page and repeated his line without drama. "Cash is not fear. Cash is time." Russell added one sentence while tightening a hose clamp on a borrowed grain cart. Most damage around here came from confusing size with margin for error. Nobody wrote slogans on the whiteboard. They wrote cash dates, rent terms, and repair costs. By late 2025, roll call in Adams County looked nothing like the whispered judgments of 1991. Eli Madsen, who once carried $1.18 million at floating rates and lost 600 acres, now managed 300 leased acres with disciplined crop plans and current payments across every account. He met with Dana every quarter, not as a cautionary tale, but as a working partner in risk review. Nora Bell's custom planning crew finished the season profitable again, netting $93,100 after maintenance and payroll, and she kept mentoring beyond her grant obligation because she said the meetings improved her own decisions. Pete Lutz remained at Hastings Ag Service, now lead mechanic on harvest season triage, and trained 2 apprentices who both came from farm families trying to avoid debt traps. Aaron Lutz still farmed 90 acres on weekends, still debt-free, and added a small seed cleaning side business that generated $18,700 in extra annual income. Thomas Reeve lived in Kearney and served on a rural scholarship committee. Calvin Morrow retired fully, but still attended one legacy panel each winter and told audiences that ratios looked different when rates jump. Dean Kessler split time between grandchildren and volunteer tax clinics for retired producers. Glenn Coleman, Russell's father, had passed away years earlier with his dignity rebuilt and his son's discipline already rooted. Russell kept Glenn's sale barn cap on a peg above the ledger shelf, not as grief theater, as reference. Leonard Pike remained what he had been in the records, a neighbor whose death triggered the land decision that tested everything afterward. Dinah, Miguel, Aaron, Travis, Jana, and Malik were all current, all operating, all mentoring at least one newer hand by trust policy or by choice. The equipment still told the same story for anyone willing to look closely. The 1979 Chevrolet C20 was still in service, mileage beyond 418,000, rust heavier, engine rebuilt once, purpose unchanged. The 2004 bankruptcy sale Combine still ran each fall with disciplined maintenance logs that were cleaner than many new machine files. The grain bins bought in 2001 still paid for themselves every season. Basis widened. The farmhouse still had modest rooms and repaired trim, and the household budget still sat near $28,000 with deliberate limits. Russell's net worth held around $18.6 million by conservative marks, mostly land and reserves, with liens at zero and no interest line, draining sleep from winter nights. The farm operated. The trust rotated capital. The mentees became mentors. Arithmetic became culture. Quietly. That evening, long after the last truck left and the yard lights clicked on, Russell sat at the kitchen table, with the same ruled book open to a fresh page. Outside, the old pickup cooled in the dark beside paid-for equipment. Inside, he wrote date, account, amount, and one final word at the end of each line, the same word that had outlasted 3 bank presidents, one loud theory of leverage, and every season that tried to force his hand. Paid. He set the pencil down, closed the ledger, and reached for the manila envelope that had lived on the top shelf since the Pike auction. The paper had softened at the corners from years of handling. Inside were 3 documents that had shaped half his life. The unused $500,000 loan package Bryce had slid across the desk in 1996, the Pike receipt stamped with no lien holder listed, and the Hargrave proof of funds letter the title attorney had read into a silent room. Russell laid all 3 on the table under the yellow kitchen light, squared their edges, and wrote one note on a fresh index card. Trust Archive, training use approved. By the 3rd week of January 2026, the Coleman Ground Lease Trust held its annual review in the machine shed office because the annex room was booked, and nobody complained about the smell of oil and cold steel. Dana arrived first with a 3-ring binder and a thermos. Miguel came in carrying 2 printed cash flow sheets and a box of bolts he had promised Pete. Nora entered with 3 younger operators behind her, each with notebooks, each talking about input timing instead of machinery paint. Russell sat at the end of the folding table in the same faded jacket and asked for numbers, not speeches. Dana read hers without looking up. Total controlled acres this cycle, 420. Gross receipts, $286,300. Operating and lease outflow, $213,900. Net before tax, $72,400. Trust loan paid in full last quarter. Machinery reserve now $81,200. Tax reserve $34,600. No revolving debt. Eli sat 2 chairs down and nodded once, a small motion that carried years. He now managed 300 leased acres under a written cost cap he and Dana reviewed monthly, current on every payment, 3 years running. He told the room his old mistake in 1 sentence. I borrowed against good weather. Then he handed his worksheet to a 23-year-old renter and walked him through rate sensitivity by hand, line by line. Miguel's update was quieter. 240 acres this year. Gross $174,900. Cost $136,400. Net $38,500. Liquidity buffer, $44,300 after fuel pre-buy. Trust balance 0. He tapped 1 column with a grease-darkened finger. Emergency repair fund used once, rebuilt in 5 months. Erin Coe followed with the same precision that had made her the board's favorite case study. Full repayment completed early, then 2 cash purchases that replaced what used to be financed upgrades. Total cost $41,700 versus projected financed outflow, $62,900 over 5 years. Preserved cash, $21,200. Travis Weller reported his sinking fund at $37,600 after 3 uninterrupted deposits. Janefeld reported stable payroll and a second full-time hire at $43,200 plus benefits, both paid without seasonal borrowing. Malik Rowan reported renewed 3-year rent terms with capped annual increases and no penalty clauses. His planning horizon now extended beyond 1 crop year, and his stress level had dropped enough that he slept through storms. The board secretary projected the multiplier sheet against a white-painted steel wall. Total trust capital deployed since inception, $690,000. Total principal repaid and redeployed, $572,000. Delinquency rate, 0.0%. Estimated commercial interest avoided at 8.2% average, $174,960. Acres directly operated by recipients in current cycle, 2,180. Acres indirectly stabilized through cooperative access and shared scheduling, 1,340. Combined footprint, 3,520 acres. At a conservative county valuation of $6,480 per acre, that was $22,809,600 in productive ground operating with lower fragility, because one man refused to confuse speed with strength. During a break, Nora set her coffee down beside Russell's old worksheet, copied from 2018, the one labeled financed path versus staged cash path. I used to think this was fear, she said, tapping the staged cash column. It is freedom with paperwork. Russell gave a half smile and slid the page toward 2 new applicants waiting near the heater. Take copies, he said. Bring back your downside math. 6 days later, Bryce stood in a community college classroom in Grand Island with 26 junior lenders and one slide that had no branding, only 2 columns and red stress marks. He had retired from volume lending, but he had not retired from accounting for what volume had done to good people. On the left, he showed a leveraged growth model with thin liquidity and aggressive renewal assumptions. On the right, he showed moderate scale with 12 months of operating cash and stage capital replacement. Then he ran the same shock sequence through both. Yield down 18%, corn down 82 cents per bushel, variable rates of 2.1%. The left column failed covenant tests in year 2 and entered forced sale probability at 43%. The right column stayed solvent, cut discretionary capital, and preserved land control. A student asked him when he first knew he had misread Russell Coleman. Bryce did not dodge. March 2018 Civic Hall panel. I watched 3 retired presidents say they never held his paper. I looked at his cuffs and still thought he was leaving money on the table. I was wrong about what table mattered. The room stayed still. He continued in the same steady tone. My old metric was loan volume per officer. My new metric is resilience, months in cash, and unpledged assets. If you finance growth without that buffer, you are not building farms. You are building exposure. By early March 2026, Bryce drove to Russell's place again, this time with a banker from Kearney in the passenger seat and no sales packet in the truck. They stood beside the 1979 Chevrolet, now past 421,000 miles, and Bryce looked at the baling wire tailgate chain that had become county folklore. You keeping that wire on purpose now? He asked. Russell nodded. Reminder cost nothing. The young banker laughed once, then grew serious when Russell opened the machine shed office and showed the 3 archived documents in clear sleeves. Bryce's 1996 offer, Pike receipt, Hargrave verification. Use them, Russell said to the visitor. Teach structure. That completed the longest unresolved look in the story. Bryce had not been hiding a secret plan that day in 2018. He had been watching his framework fail and had needed time to admit it out loud. By planting season, roll call read like a ledger balanced after a long storm. Eli Madsen was stable and current. Dana Madsen was profitable and mentoring. Nora Bell ran a custom crew with repeat contracts and trained new operators each winter. Pete Lutz remained lead mechanic at Hastings Ag Service and had turned his bay into an apprenticeship lane for 2 farm kids each year. Aaron Lutz still farmed 90 acres debt-free on weekends and expanded his seed cleaning side work to $22,100 annual gross. Miguel Santos, Aaron Coe, Travis Weller, Janefeld, and Malik Rowan were all current, all operating, all participating in mentorship, formal or informal. Thomas Reeves still served on the scholarship committee in Kearney and funded 1 agricultural accounting award with his own check each spring. Calvin Morrow, now fully retired, attended 1 winter panel annually and repeated the same caution about floating assumptions. Dean Kessler volunteered at tax clinics and reviewed depreciation schedules for older producers at no charge. Leonard Pike remained honored each November when the trust posted the annual acreage report, because his land sale had triggered the county's hard arithmetic lesson. Glenn Coleman's cap stayed on the peg above Russell's shelf, brim faded, dusted monthly, never moved. Russell did not become ceremonial. He still checked hydrants at dawn, still tracked engine hours by hand, still patched what could be patched. The farmhouse still had modest rooms and the original furnace, finally replaced only after it failed safely. New unit cost $8,740, paid at installation. Old unit hauled out by Pete and Aaron on a Saturday. Household spending for 2025 closed at $28,140, slightly above his old line and still disciplined. Net worth at spring 2026, appraisal marks stood near $19.1 million with no liens. The trust stood separate at $3.46 million after earnings, disbursements, and repayments. The old combine still cut. The 2001 bins still paid basis spreads. The truck still started most mornings on the second turn. By then, the language in coffee shops had changed. People no longer pointed first at cab year or sheet metal. They asked about reserve runway, reset exposure, and what could be sold without breaking next season's plan. At the feed counter one morning, a renter wrote a question on scrap receipt paper and passed it down the line. Minimum cash runway in months before taking growth debt. Nobody laughed at the question. They argued numbers, penciled scenarios, and went back to their books. That night, after the last text from Dana, confirming seed delivery, and after the trust treasurer emailed the signed minutes, Russell sat again at the same kitchen table, under the same light. He opened the ruled book to a clean page, entered date, account, amount, and purpose. Outside, rust cooled on steel. Inside, numbers held their shape. He drew a straight line beneath the final entry and wrote the word that had carried him from judgment to legacy, from private caution to public usefulness, from survival to generosity. Paid.